Well, thank you so much for coming out on this challenging night. As I was driving in from Carbondale today, and as I was, approaching Peoria and the snow was starting to fall, I recalled a moment from about a month ago. My wife and I had the good fortune to go to Hawaii for 2 weeks over Christmas holidays, and we stayed in an island called Kauai, which is a western island, in the northern part near a town called Hanalei, which was where South Pacific was filmed. And so we had one night, it was there's an overlook, and we're looking out over the Hanalei Bay. In the near distance, you can see, boats and surfers. In the far distance, the Pacific Ocean, mountains and clouds coming at you. And my wife is like, "Isn't this amazing?" I said, "It kind of reminds me of Grandview Drive in Peoria." She looked at me and I said, "Well, sort of." but actually, Grandview is one of my 2 or 3 most favorite places in the world. Hanalei Bay on about 75 degrees might edge it out a little bit, but it's still in contention. So, well, again, thank you for coming out, and it's good to be back in Peoria. I grew up here. I haven't been here for, I was back here last summer, but I haven't really lived here for a time in many years. But I think I have some pretty good Peoria chops. My dad worked at CAT his entire career. I went to Spalding High School. I went to Holy Family Grade School. My first job was at the Lariat Club as a busboy. And I love those steaks. I still can picture them now. One summer in college, I worked at Hiram Walker Distillery. Another summer I worked at Jubilee College State Park. And one summer I worked at the Peoria and Pekin Union Railroad, which was still the hardest job I've ever had. And also my 8th grade religion teacher was Ray LaHood. I see him in D.C. and I tease him about that every now and then. He's probably only 10 or 11 years older than me, so he was right out of Bradley. He was 22 and I was 10 or 11 years old, so he was Mr. LaHood. And I remember he was teaching a course in the Old Testament. And even back then, I sort of sensed that Ray was maybe just a class or 2 ahead of the class. I think he was kind of learning Old Testament on the fly. I teased him about that too. And I was like, yeah, probably not. So, well, what I'd like to do tonight is talk a little bit about my background, mostly in the context of the broader point about leadership challenges, which I think are really critical both in Illinois and in Washington and really across the world, and talk a little bit about my work at the Simon Institute, which we're trying to work on some projects related to leadership. As I mentioned, I grew up in Peoria, went to Spalding High School, then I went to Knox College in Galesburg and studied political science there. As I was finishing up at Knox, I wasn't sure what I was going to do, and thought about journalism, politics, wasn't quite certain. And then Governor Jim Thompson created a program of governor's fellows. It was going to be a 1-year fellowship in which you rotate through the governor's office. And it was a way of launching, they hoped, careers in state government. So I was one of the first selected in the first class. And I remember my first couple of weeks of the job, my first assignment was the legislative office in Governor Thompson's office. And it was headed up then by a young gentleman by the name of Jim Edgar. Who went on to do some good things. In fact, I had lunch. He took me out to lunch like my first day in the job. I'm thinking, God, this guy seems like he has some potential here. And I told my friends, I said, well, yeah, it's well known that he's on the rise. So, and I actually happened to see him. I had lunch with him last summer in Springfield and kind of reminded him of that lunch and all. So I had a year-long experience in the governor's office. Then I worked for another year in state government. And then I had a great good fortune to win a Rotary Fellowship. Rotary had these, I don't think they still have them, this particular program, but it was an amazing program where if you won an award, you could go to the country of your choice for a year, and you traveled around that country giving speeches about life in your hometown or whatever topic you chose. So I won it, and I went to Sydney, Australia, and spent a year traveling around Australia telling them all about Peoria. Most people knew of Caterpillar. And actually, before I left, I had a friend who worked in the Illinois Department of Commerce. So they gave me these little Illinois pins. And I had like 300 of them. So I was distributing them liberally to about everyone I met. And I'm sure they're now showing up in antique shows and country fairs or something. It's like, what is this? It must be worth $1 million, gold from from Illinois. So that was an amazing experience. I ended up staying for another 6 months and got a master's in history. Came back to Springfield, replenished my finances a bit, and then I had a chance to move to Brussels, where I worked for 6 months in a kind of an internship program at the European Union. And then during the course of that experience, I met some people at the Wall Street Journal Europe and was able to finagle a year-long internship there, which is how I really got interested in journalism, and this sort of solidified that interest. Came back to the States, went to grad school in D.C., and then ended up working for a company called Market News International. In 1991, it was one of these jobs. I said, okay, I'll do it for a year, get positioned in D.C., do something else. 26 years later, I left. But it was an amazing job. I had the world's nicest boss who just said, go up to Capitol Hill and be a reporter. And so I had a little desk in the Senate press gallery and was allowed to just, as a congressional reporter, you're given a press pass and you can just sort of go wherever you want. So you're walking down the hall and here's John McCain, or you're in line for a cup of coffee and Ted Kennedy's behind you. And it's just some of this amazing exposure to people and to just the policy debates up close. So I did that for 26 years. During that same time, early in my DC time, I managed to get a gig with a diplomatic magazine writing about diplomats. So that was sort of my night job. I would interview diplomats and go to receptions, and that was, I had a column for 12 or 13 years in which I would profile people in diplomacy. And the one thing I found is when you have an hour-long interview, you can only go so deep, And I was thinking, some of these people, diplomats in D.C. are so impressive. It would be really interesting to do a deeper dive and spend more time with one particular person. So I approached, and one of the questions that was in my mind is like, what does a modern ambassador do? Because I was interviewing a fair amount of ambassadors. I'm like, what does a modern ambassador do? So I sought out Sweden's ambassador to the U.S. and said, could I just I'll keep my regular job, but could I shadow you for a period of time and use that as a basis of a book about an in-depth study of what an ambassador does? And this gentleman he was near the end of his career, so he thought, well, let me just think about it a little bit. And a couple days later, he got back to me and said, okay, yeah, let's do it. So over the course of the next 2 years, I interviewed him regularly. And one thing you learn, I was talking to some of the people in the communications, as you kind of learn as you go about the art of interviewing. And my first couple of interviews with him were on a Friday afternoon. And he's one of these people who was totally attentive, but I could tell that he knew that I'd walk out of the office and there'd be like 7 people in line to see him next. And I knew that must be weighing on him, that he just, this was at the end of a busy workday. So I said, is there a better time to do it? And his wife had just moved back to Sweden for a government job. He said, if you want to just come to my residence on a Sunday afternoon, let's just, be much more informal and let's just, have kind of conversations. So for 6 or so months I would do that, and he had this remarkably elegant residence on Embassy Row, and I'd meet him and he'd give me a beer, a glass of wine, and it was just sort of talking about his career in diplomacy. And this guy had done everything. Sweden has one of the world's best diplomatic services, and he was one of their top diplomats, and just regaled me with stories. He spent, I think, 10 or 12 hours in effectively one-on-one meetings with Saddam Hussein, trying to negotiate the end of the Iran-Iraq war. And so he told me some riveting stories of walking through the presidential palace and passing people, and he says everyone on their eyes was just utter terror. It was not a cozy work environment, as you might guess. But it was interesting just watching the ambassador up close. And part of my research challenge, this was a little different than the Peoria Pekin Railroad. He says, come to any of my receptions you like, and he held, a couple receptions a week. And so it's like, again, on Embassy Row, these, amazing spread of food, wine, and he was this consummate networker. So there would be times you turn around and go to the bar, and there's like Sandra Day O'Connor standing there, or William Rehnquist. At one point I said, how was your party last night? I couldn't go. And he said, He said, pretty good. I had a majority of the Supreme Court. This wasn't totally frivolous. I mean, what he was trying to do is make his embassy the place to be and to attract people. And he could really figure out what was going on in the United States, get a sense of the mood of the country by, or at least the elite mood of the country by talking to these sorts of folks. But it was interesting to watch him because he's one of these guys who was extremely strategic. I mean, he had every summer he would spend a period of time charting out his agenda for the year. It was very thoughtful and strategic. But he was also very kind of a tactically shrewd operator. He was very, very gifted socially. At parties, he'd work the room like, Bill Clinton. And he had sort of a natural affinity for names and so forth. But then I talked to him once and he said, before a party, he would spend about a half an hour preparing. He would go into a private office and he'd go through the guest list and say, okay, who's going to be here? How do I know him? When did I see him last? When am I going to see him next? So even for parties, he would prepare for parties. He once told me, somewhat whimsically, he says, there's one key in diplomacy, one key that's really important. It's the art of the 45-second conversation. He said, when you go to these receptions, you cannot talk to people for 10 minutes, or particularly if you're hosting it, but you got to talk to everyone for at least a bit, and you got to have something to say, and it shouldn't be just, hey, what's going on? I mean, you should be able to lock in and have at least a few things to say and have kind of a meaningful exchange. And he was a master. I mean, watching him up close was sort of watching Tom Brady or LeBron James or Steph Curry. I mean, he was this total master of his craft. And I was mentioning this story over dinner. So as my book was coming out, he says, I'm going to be retiring. I'm not sure what I'm going to do. The book comes out, and a couple weeks later, he's named Sweden's foreign minister. A year passes, and then he's named the president of the UN General Assembly. It's a rotating one-year presidency. When that finishes, he becomes the Deputy Secretary General of the UN, the number 2 person in the UN. And he's more formally retired back in Sweden. And I have so I wrote this book about him, but I have a kind of a hankering to do a follow-on book about just, what he's learned in the last phase of his career. I tease him, I say, you've done pretty good after our book came out. It was funny too, this is a guy who speaks 5 languages. And I showed him the draft of my book, once it was with the publisher, and he read it, and he says, this is pretty it's a well-written book. He says, but at one point, you really go into the passive tense very much. He says, well, why is that? He says, you're using the subjunctive in the wrong way. I mean, he had this very nuanced understanding of English grammar, which kind of put me to shame since he also spoke about 5 other languages. So, remarkable guy. Book came out. It was so much fun. I said, I want to do something like this. And I thought, what I'd love to do is follow a senator who's involved in foreign policy. And the same sort of thing. What is it like to be a senator involved in foreign policy? At the time, Richard Lugar was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, a man who was a senator from Indiana. I had known him a little bit from just my reporting, so I approached his office and I said, any chance, that he might want to, let me shadow him and do this kind of book? And they said, well, I don't know, we'll have to see. Let me just talk to him. So the next day, his press guy calls me back. He says, Senator Lugar would like to meet you on Friday in the Senate dining room at noon to talk about this project. So I took that as an encouraging sign, and they usually don't invite you to those things if they want to say no. But it was interesting because Lugar showed up with like 6 staffers, and they asked all the tough questions. Okay, how much time commitment? Are we going to have any control over this project? I said no. So they were playing kind of the bad cop. But at the end of the lunch, Senator Lugar said, let's do it. Let's go forward. And so I spent really the next 4 or 5 years working on this project. I was working my full-time job, but I was interviewing him regularly in D.C. I spent a week with him in Indiana. Went to Russia, Albania, and Ukraine with Senator Lugar and a small congressional delegation once to see how he did his work internationally. So it was a wonderful project, but the one thing that was a little bit of a struggle is that Senator Lugar has an affliction that I think is somewhat common to Midwestern men of his generation, which is he's too modest. He couldn't brag on himself, or he didn't like to brag on himself. So, which is a wonderful, endearing human trait. But when you're writing a biography of someone or a book about someone, you like someone who would be, more forthcoming and disclosive. And so I had to find some other ways to learn about him, and had to interview a number of his colleagues. And maybe in the Q&A, I will tell you about my interview with Joe Biden, which was one of the kind of amazing moments of my journalistic life. But I'll say that for the end. So as I finished up, I wrote the Lugar book, and the one thing about the Lugar book took me about 5 years, and it was hard because Senator Lugar just was not that disclosive, and I was busy with some other things, and it was just I was just struggling to kind of get my grounding. And actually, I had to change publishers midstream, and I went to Indiana University Press, which wanted a different type of book than what I was initially perceiving. So I had to make some adjustments. And the whole premise of the book was that Lugar was so strong in Indiana politically that he could work on foreign policy. Now, this premise was absolutely true for 34 of the 36 years he was in the Senate. Unfortunately, the last 2 years, as I'm finishing off the book, it's becoming clear that politically he's in a difficult situation. And actually, I was able to make some adjustments in the book to kind of couch that thesis a little bit. And, a couple weeks actually after the book came out, he lost a Republican primary. So the one thing I took away from that is it's just very, very hard to write a book about a serving politician. I mean, facts are changing too quickly to catch up with it in book format. I mean, if you're doing blogs or essays, that's one thing, but I really don't want to do a book on kind of a living politician. My two other books, I won't go into them at great length. I did a book called JFK in the Senate, which is about Kennedy's Senate career, which was a fun project. And then I just finished this book on the Kennedy Eisenhower transition. And I might even just give you a one sentence or a minute on that, because it kind of tells you how at least for me, how book writing happens. Because I finished this book, JFK in the Senate, and I thought, okay, I'm sort of done with Kennedy. I have a lot of stuff. Had really immersed myself in his Senate career from 52 to 60. But I couldn't use it all for the book, so I still had some stuff, and I wasn't sure that I was really going to do anything more with it. And I was in a bookstore in Washington, D.C., and I was flipping through an anthology of great speeches in American history. And I was just looking at the table of content. So most of these speeches are separated by 5, 10, 15 years. And then I see two speeches that are separated by 3 days. Eisenhower's farewell, and Kennedy's inaugural. So immediately thinking, two of the great speeches in American history are separated by 3 days. How did people process it? What was the reaction? So I was taking the metro back to my house in D.C., and I was, the person sitting next to me must have thought I was a crazy guy, because I pulled out my notepad, and I basically sketched out the broad parameters of the book in the course of a 20-minute metro ride. It took about 3 years of research to fill in some of these gaps. But it was just, it's funny how it was just triggered by looking at another book and seeing a table of contents and saying, man, there has to be a story there. And it was a really interesting and remarkable story to dig into. So I was, back, life was good in D.C., and at one point I was speaking on JFK in the Senate at a conference in Boston. And I'm finishing up, and this guy comes up to me, and he introduces himself as a librarian from Southern Illinois University. I'm like, oh, great, So we had a nice conversation, and then that night, a group from the conference went out to dinner. My wife came along, and we were palling around with him, and very nice, amiable guy, nice connection, exchange emails. So we started just, lightly corresponding every couple months. How's it going? What's up? And then out of the blue, there was an email. He sent me a note. He said, the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute is looking for a new director. I said no back. Interesting, that's about all I said. I guess I was not picking up on the hint. So 2 weeks later, he said they're really seriously looking, and I think you'd be great for it. And I said, well, thanks, but I'm comfortable in D.C. and life is good. And he said, okay. And then about 2 weeks later, he sent me a note. He says, I'm going to nominate you tomorrow. And if you're interested, you have to apply by June 1. So then my wife and I had a long conversation, and I had covered Paul Simon as a reporter. I had great respect for him. I had heard really good things about the Institute. And it was, I was doing kind of a reflection on my life, and I've been a reporter for 26 years. I loved it. Almost every day was fun to go to work. But reporting after at least a quarter century, I felt like I was getting a little bit stale, that I was sort of doing the same old stuff, and it was maybe time to try something else. And so I applied for this job. It was a very long interview process. And the pitch I made, which is what I'm trying to implement, is like, the Institute is in Southern Illinois. That's where its roots are. It's working on Illinois issues, which is good, but it needs to have a national reach, a specific national reach, to be able to be attractive, alive, vital, and candidly to raise funds. A think tank that's just focused on Southern Illinois, I don't think is going to have it's going to have a tougher road to hoe. And that was the message I made in the various interviews, and it was the one that I think earned me the job, which I started just a year ago. And so I am, my wife, who grew up in Philadelphia, has lived in Los Angeles, New York. The smallest city she has lived in before Carbondale was Washington, D.C. So she is a big city gal who's in Carbondale. But she's one of these people, I'm sure she's going to be mayor of Carbondale in 3 or 4 years. She knows more people than I do. She's involved in a bunch of stuff, and it's just sort of like, okay, this is not what I thought. She's actually writing a blog and maybe a newspaper article about life in the middle, she calls it, because she's never lived in the Midwest. It just she sees things through a set of eyes that I can't. I mean, she'll see signs, and she's like, "Are you kidding me?" There's this little remote road in Carbondale, and the sign says "congested area." There's not even a deer within 10 miles. So we're driving, and she jumps out the car, jumps out, takes a picture, and puts it on her Instagram, and she has hundreds of responses. Her friends from Los Angeles, congested area. Put them on the 405. We'll see what congested is. But at the Simon Institute, what we're trying to do is reflect Paul Simon's best values, which I think is a approach to government that is civil, that's respectful, that's focused on solving problems rather than just tearing away at each other. And so we've devised a couple programs that I think reflect that. One of them, which has been fun to just advance, is trying to restructure the congressional town hall meeting. Back in the day, it was considered, sort of an essential pillar of our democracy to have town hall meetings. And Paul Simon, for his career, he would come into a town hall meeting, he would sit on a chair with a notepad, he'd have a microphone like this, he'd say, "I'm Paul Simon, what's on your mind?" That era has changed, in part because as our politics have become more polarized, the opposite party sends people to ask provocative questions and to stage demonstrations and get these people to say embarrassing things. And so one of the things we're trying to do is just see if there's a way that we can structure these town hall meetings so there are actually meaningful and respectful exchanges. We came up with a set of best practices, which we sent out to the Illinois Congressional Delegation last summer, and we're revising them and are going to send out a slightly revised package in a couple of weeks. And we're also going to send it to members of the Illinois General Assembly, giving them some ideas about how to conduct town hall meetings. Second project is we're calling it Renewing Illinois. And this is a project that strikes me, having been gone for 25 years. And when I came back, my first thought is, what has happened here? Not that when I was, covering Springfield, it was, gold, statesman galore. But it was at least a basic problem-solving approach to the world. Tried to get a budget every year, tried to pay bills. It may not have been heroic, but it was just the basics of government. And that is sort of dissipated and gone. And it's just, so what we're going to do is we're trying to say, how do we rethink Illinois and to try to renew the state? And we're starting at this spring by hosting a summit of university students from throughout Illinois. We're going to give some structure, but a lot of it we want it to be kind of open-ended. It's like, what would it take for you to want to stay here and settle here? obviously we can't give you an ocean or skiing or, but I mean, in this sort of, practical sense, what is it about Illinois' governance that is discouraging people from staying? So we're working hard on getting that put together. And the third initiative I've mentioned kind of in glancing is statesmanship. And this is something that I've thought about as I've looked at politics in D.C. and Springfield and even my time in Brussels. And it's the sense of, why, let me just define statesmanship. There's been, they've literally, Plato wrote an essay on statesmanship. So what actually it is has been under fierce debate for several millennia. But we're trying to develop a kind of practical definition. And we say statesmanship is a type of leadership that is characterized by a couple things: vision, courage, compassion, civility, fairness, and effectiveness. And let me unpack each word for just a minute, because I know that they can sound like cliches or sound bites, but vision, looking to the future, making decisions that are not just relevant to the current election cycle, but are actually thinking to the long term, to the next generation. Courage, taking some tough votes, making hard choices rather than just kicking the can down the road. Compassion, empathy, kindness. My friend the ambassador used to say, one of his signature lines, he said, "Without passion, nothing happens. Without compassion, the wrong things happen." And I think there's a lot to that. Civility, of course, is just the emblematic of Paul Simon, who was just treated everyone with great respect. Fairness is something that is a profound concept when you think about it. I'm going to make a quick reference to it later, but to me it's a really important concept. And also effectiveness. You can have the most wonderful ideas in the world, but until you can bring about a final product, it's not as quite as significant or impressive. And to me, the statesman is, whether it's in Illinois or in Washington, the first question should be, what is in the larger interest? The second question is, what is in my personal interest? And third would be, what is in my party's interest? And I think, in the real world, politicians are going to say, what's in my personal interest and party interest? I mean, I expect them not to ignore those questions, but I don't think it's unrealistic. They could at least start out by saying, what's in the national interest or the state interest? And I think that is something that you don't see a lot of. I would point to this government shutdown. Not too many people, there was a lot of tactical maneuverings, but I didn't see a lot of people say, okay, what is in the country's best interest? That was not the first question people were asking, I would posit. And I think, as I look at both Illinois history and U.S. history, we've had statesmen and stateswomen. It's not a gender term. Arthur Vandenberg in the 40s, put his Republican presidential aspirations in doubt by working with Truman on the Marshall Plan and NATO. Howard Baker in the 70s put his Republican presidential aspirations in doubt by working with Jimmy Carter on the Panama Canal treaties. Richard Lugar confronted Ronald Reagan in 1986 on economic sanctions in South Africa, saying it's right. Lugar in 2010 worked with President Obama on an arms control treaty with Russia, and he said it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do. And I think even in Illinois history, Richard Ogilvie in 1969, newly elected governor, imposed the first income tax, saying, we need the revenue for the level of services people want. We need more revenues. And he put that, and he ended up losing his election. I guess the point I want to make is statesmanship. It's a high ideal, but it's not an impossible one. I mean, you have Abraham Lincoln, who I think might be the archetypal statesman. From Illinois, self-made person, but he seems to be on a level that most of us can't aspire to. But I think that there are some ways that in the real world statesmanship can flourish. And one of the things we're trying to do with the Simon Institute is create this program on statesmanship, just to remind a new generation, or maybe to tell and instruct a new generation, and remind some of the older people that high-level leadership is possible. It doesn't have to be just, tired, old, reactive, short-term politics. as I look at the current situation, it seems to me that there will be plenty of opportunities for statesmanship in both Springfield and D.C. And yet I see the challenges as a little different. I think in Springfield we have a new administration. The Democrats are in control of the state capitol. So I think it's incumbent upon them to address problems in a kind of fundamental, substantive way, and not just kick the can down the road and kind of rely on positive atmospherics. I mean, they are in charge and they should try to do things and solve real problems. But I think Republicans have a responsibility to try to help out when they can, and when they can't, to give constructive alternatives. Not to just hammer the Democrats, but to say, okay, we think that their budget is way out of line, but this is what our alternative is. And that's, I think, something that will be interesting to track in the coming months. In D.C., the challenges are probably more than we have time to talk about tonight. Just two that strike me as obvious. I mean, as someone who covered the budget for many years, we don't read very much about the budget now. The United States is close to $1 trillion annual budget deficit in a full employment economy. We have a booming economy and nearly $1 trillion in annual deficits. That is asinine. That is wrong. And both parties, as someone who covered this, both parties are complicit. There is plenty of hypocrisy and plenty of evasion. And even, when I started covering budget in 1991, they were saying these entitlement programs for the baby boomers are going to hammer the country. And you could have made a couple of relatively minor adjustments in 1991 in our situation, and there would have been some tough votes, and people would have lost elections, no doubt. But this country's posture would be fundamentally different than what it is now. So I don't know. No one talks about it anymore. I mean, if we go into a recession, God knows how large the deficit is going to grow to. And it just seems to me that one of the responsibilities of government and governance is to balance resources and commitments, and we just have not done a good job. So that's going to be a challenge to see if someone steps up and tries to address that. Obviously, Bob Mueller's report is going to test this political system probably in a way that it has not been tested since Watergate. And what I'm hoping is, I mentioned fairness, that fairness pervades, that Democrats set aside their antipathy for Trump and look at the evidence in a hard and fair way and say if this rises to impeachable crimes, to begin the process. But also not say, well, Trump is going to, he's in peril now. If we do articles of impeachment, we're just going to fire up his base and ensure he gets reelected. So there's plenty of ways that Democrats could either be too aggressive or not aggressive enough on this. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see if they rise to the challenge. And I think it's going to be very, very interesting to see if Republicans rise to the challenge. I think they have, for those of us who were there during the Clinton impeachment, boy, I heard a lot of times perjury is perjury, but now it seems like, well, if it was, if he's pressured by Mueller and this and that. I mean, so to me, the essential quality is to be fair and to say, and to hold both sides accountable. And actually, this is kind of a radical thought, to expect more from your side than the other side. Rather than saying, okay, my person, I'm a Democrat and we're not great, but we're sure as hell better than the Republicans. I mean, to me, that's not good enough. It should be, I expect more from my people than the Republicans. Because we are, if you're a Democrat, we're better. If you're a Republican, we're better. And I think I've been really struck at how few people hold themselves and their party to a high standard. And one small example of this in the real world, a congressman who I have great respect for, former Congressman Lee Hamilton from Indiana, chaired the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And I used to go to his hearings when I had first started in D.C. This was 91, 92, and particularly 93, because there was a new Clinton administration, and he was the House Democratic Chairman of the International Relations Committee. So I saw him hold hearings with the Secretary of State, it was Warren Christopher at the time, and Hamilton was just he was very respectful, very polite, but he was really, really tough. And could you clarify? Could you explain? And I'm like, man, son. It was so stunning, and it's like he actually is holding his side to account. He's not carrying water for him. He's not trying to protect them. He's being respectful, but he's asking them to explain their policies and to produce good policies. And that's, to me, that's a humanly achievable aspiration. And I hope that's something that that we can see more of in the coming years. And I mean, what can we do at the Simon Institute? We're in the southern tip of Illinois. 5.5-hour train ride to Chicago that always takes 7 hours. Closer to Atlanta than Chicago. My wife spent her birthday in Paducah, Kentucky. So we're way down in the southern portion of the state. But what I want to do is, one of the things we are going to do is produce a book by the end of this year before the presidential campaign, in which we're calling the Urgent Need for Statesmanship, and suggesting a citizen's guide, and suggesting questions that citizens ask their public officials, and suggest some standards that we should try to hold them accountable to. But it's also going to challenge the citizens to step up too, because I think as much as we can lament the poor leadership, I think there's been some pretty poor followership, both in Illinois and across the country. I think we've allowed people to get away with things. We voted for people whose behavior and record is probably not deserving of endorsements by us. So one of the points of this book is going to be to challenge people to develop a kind of a way of thinking about leadership and citizenship. And we hope to really get the word out and at least put this document into circulation. So, well, let me just stop there, and thank you for listening, and I'd be glad to take any questions or comments or anything else. Angela?
We have a rule. This is a civil discussion at all times, so the World Affairs Council prides itself on being one of those organizations that still likes to enjoy civil discussion. So feel free to disagree, but remember we're all friends here. So, and ask a question. So I like to pontificate. Those of you who are my students know this well. You don't get to. So ask a question, and let's hear from John Shaw, his perspective on what you would like to find out. Dewey?
There's much greater adhesion in the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. What kind of leadership in the Democratic Party is more effective than in the Republican Party?
If you can repeat it, too.
The question pertains to the cohesion in the Democratic Party and why it's so solid now versus Republican Party and what to attribute that to. I think two words might explain it. Donald Trump. I mean, I think the Democrats are united in their opposition to him. I don't see a great deal of cohesion on policies, for example. I mean, there's still, as we know, I think the left wing of the party, which has been very emboldened, has a far different economic agenda than Barack Obama pursued, and certainly different than Bill Clinton pursued. So I do think that, I don't know that the Democrats are an inherently more cohesive party. I think that I think both parties right now have a fairly strong cohesion to them. In fact, one of the things I've learned just in history is when I studied like the Kennedy-Eisenhower era is that the parties were fundamentally different. The Republican Party was a big, broad party with liberals, moderates, and conservatives. The Democrats were a big, broad party with moderates, liberals, and conservatives. And liberal Democrats worked much more closely with liberal Republicans than they did with conservative Democrats. And so there wasn't this sort of polarized Dems versus Republican mentality back then. I think the parties have polarized. I think they've become more ideologically cohesive. And I think the Democrats seem more cohesive now, largely because there is strong agreement about their criticisms of President Trump. I don't see all that much cohesion on policy issues. That's just my perspective.
I've noticed within my own generation as things get worse, there's a large amount of apathy towards the political world and things like voting and just being involved within your own country and political system. do you think that's a solvable problem, or as things get worse, people are just simply going to move away from the problem as much as they can?
That's a great question, and I think what might happen, and I think would not be an awful development, is just a lot of the political energy being at a local level, whether it be cities, towns, etc. And even the statesmanship initiative that we're working on, we're thinking about constructing awards, and one of the things we're thinking about is maybe an award for just statesmen, stateswomen as mayors, people who are working at a local level, are solving problems, taking on tough issues, not kicking the can down the road. So, I don't know if the product that is being delivered by both Washington and Springfield is not necessarily encouraging of optimism and hope. So, in some sense, people's anger and frustration is understandable. And we would hope that it would be channeled more into being participants, even at a local level or national level. So I don't know. I don't know if the political product is so bad that people are permanently soured, or whether there may be, an activist cycle that is about to occur. I don't know. I hope so.
Yeah, so you said you spent much time doing reporting in D.C. I'm kind of curious what you noticed. Like, there's only a little bit that you get to see on TV when there's different stuff televised. What is kind of the culture there behind the scenes in the Senate and the House? Do you kind of recognize in your time there?
That's a great question. It's changed in part because Congress is a really, really fun beat. And it's the institution that is most accessible. So more and more news services are sending more and more reporters up there. And I say that because back in, when I started in the 90s, it wasn't a backwater, but you got to know senators pretty well. Even if they didn't know your name, they'd see you every day in the hall, and you'd banter with them, and you might, they might have a press conference, and then you kind of wait afterwards and talk to them for a few minutes and say, no, in this press conference you say you're pushing the sanctions bill. Are you really going to push it? He says, well, we're just trying to send a signal to the administration. So there'd be a kind of a candor and a back and forth exchange that you don't see on TV. And so a lot of the press conferences were sort of staged for effect. And you do see more civility. Just like walking through, you see senators talking and laughing. From different parties and so forth. So it's maybe not quite as rancorous as it might appear from watching TV. The one thing I was mentioning someone when I taught to journalism classes, they often say, okay, so is the media biased? And I usually say, well, it is. It's really, really biased. It's biased towards conflict. As a reporter, you love conflict. If you can find a Democrat and Republican fighting, great. If you can find two Republicans fighting, even better. If you can find a Republican senator hammering a Republican president, great. And it's, who knows how to deconstruct all of it. Part of it is editors' love. I think reporters sense that, stories that have conflict are going to get more clicks or higher placement, so they gravitate towards it. I think the cable networks are, if I can say, egregious on this. A story I told someone, a year or so ago, I was, covering the Senate, and the first 2 or 3 minutes of the Senate session, McConnell and Schumer went back and forth and exchanged a few jabs, sort of perfunctory. And then they went off and went to the back room and figured out the day's schedule. But then you would turn on MSNBC and Fox, and it would say, Senate war escalates. McConnell and Schumer are on war footing. And then you would see this 2-minute exchange looped endlessly for 8 hours. Breaking news, Senate war escalates. And I'd come home from work and my wife would say, oh my God, what was going on there? I said, it was 2 minutes of kind of staged back and forth. So I do think, I think the cable networks, and I will say, I think both MSNBC playing to its base and Fox playing to its base and CNN playing to the base that it's trying to find I don't think they're doing us a service. I think that they are badly distorting what is happening, and I think they are contributing to this corrosive and acrimonious culture. So that's lots of different things. I mean, it's fun. I mean, a lot of these, I was mentioning someone, the one thing that's kind of striking when you go to Washington is, there's certain people that, you sort of like ideologically, and then you sort of bump into them every day and they're kind of snappish and rude or something. And then other people you just totally disagree with on everything. And they turn out to be like the nicest people. You're chatting with them, about, over in the coffee shop, and they're, hey, how's your family doing? That sort of thing. So it's a very rich, interesting place. If you have a chance to be there and to be a reporter there, it's a great opportunity. And I do think that I don't know if an equilibrium will be reached, because the thing that worries me most is there's so much focus now on time. I mean, and getting stuff out right away, as opposed to solidifying it and making sure that you have, factually established things. I mean, I was mentioning to someone, when I started out, you could go to a press conference and you wouldn't have to, as a financial wire, I wouldn't have to write my story until at least the end of the press conference. And even that is ridiculous. You run out of a press conference to write a story. Now, I mean, when my last year as a reporter, I might have to write 2 or 3 or 4 stories about the press conference. And a lot of times what they say at the front end, they're kind of backing off the back end. So I'm just worried about this sort of hyperactivity, this sort of kind of relentless focus on time. And it was interesting, I was talking to a group in Carbondale, and just the other day, and they said, how do we get through this awful, difficult political time? And I said, I'll give you one modest piece of advice. Turn off the TV, at least some, and watch PBS's NewsHour rather than the 2 cables. Because they try, I believe, to call it fair, call it straight. They're not trying to jack up ratings with breaking news all the time. And, slow your own head down and just watch it, watch the NewsHour 6 to 7 or 5 to 6 whenever it's on here, and just try to kind of, just slow down this focus of, and also I think reading books. I say these to students. I know it's become increasingly a disappearing art, but I encourage people to read it. And the other thing I said to the people in Carbondale, they said, how do we get through this difficult time? I said, well, I have a suggestion. For those of you who are Republicans, read a biography of a Republican senator, a Republican that you admire, and also a Democrat. Read a biography of Eisenhower and Truman. And a Democrat, read a biography of Roosevelt and Vandenberg. And just sort of understand that both parties have good traditions that have been sort of eroded, I would say, in recent times. So that's a long, rambling response to the political environment that is just very, very fraught and tense right now.
It seems that the last several administrations on both sides, the party out of power acts like they're weakened, that they can't do anything. And the only thing they can tell you is that they despise the guy in power. So we want to make sure Obama fails. And both sides have done this. When Bush was president, it seemed like the Democrats acted like they were weakened, and the system did not empower them to do anything. And it seems to me that's prevents anything successful from happening, because parties are beating their heads against the wall. I just wanted you to comment on that.
Yeah, and in fact, one of the things that I thank you for all you did with the Rising Star, Setting Sun book, Mike. But one of the points that came out of that book to me was that Kennedy and Eisenhower, they were not pals, weren't friends. This book is not a bromance. They were rivals and opponents, but they weren't enemies. And that's where I think politics has sort of fallen off the rail. And I think both parties see the other party as enemies, as opposed to just people with a different philosophical perspective. And I don't know how we get back to that. I mean, I think that there's occasional efforts at bipartisanship. And again, Senator Lugar, I mean, he one of the reasons he lost a Republican primary was because he worked with President Obama on an arms control treaty. He worked in the national interest. There's another Republican senator, Bob Bennett from Utah, who was a very, very conservative Republican. It became known, had informal lunches with Rod Wyden, senator from Oregon, a Democrat, about possible tax reform. They didn't even have a proposal, as I remember it. But that became the vehicle by which Bob Bennett lost a Republican primary. He's secretly conspiring with a Democrat to raise your taxes and that sort of thing. And it was a special case. It was a caucus, as I recall. So I don't know how we get back to a more adult kind of politics. And I certainly don't pretend that the Simon Institute Statesmanship Initiative will be the thing that's going to turn American democracy. But at least it's going to be a way of trying to frame it that both parties have honorable traditions, and that we need to expect both parties to rise to their best traditions.
Any thoughts, either yourself personally or the Simon Institute, on term limits? Whether you think that allows for people to make national decisions versus worrying about what the impact might be for them in the next election?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been, I've sort of taken in the kind of notion that, elections impose term limits. But then you have to face the reality that something like 95 or 98% of House members running for re-election get re-elected. And we were talking about, one of the parts of this whole problem is, of course, the money in our politics. And I was telling the story over dinner that as a reporter, as you might know, that lawmakers are not allowed to raise money in their offices. That's a strict federal law. But what parties have done, they have literally leased out office space across the street from the Capitol. So you see lawmakers during the lunch hour running across the street to go to the phone banks and making their phone calls to raise money. Yeah, I talked to one senator who said when he was up for re-election, he would spend 2 or 3 hours a day on the phone trying to raise money. The thing is, when you invest that much into getting a seat, you're going to be a lot less reluctant to take the hard votes. You've squeezed your friends out of every dime that you can, and calling up strangers. You've humiliated yourself, and so after having won a seat at that point, I guess it's not totally surprising that people are not dying to walk the plank and take a tough vote. So I don't know. I think it's been pretty well established that in our current constitutional structure that congressional term limits are not constitutional. The state term limits are, and in some cases, in some states, I don't know what really political science says on the governance of states that have term limits versus those that don't.
Did you have a question?
Oh, I was going to ask about the tension between money and statesmanship, and you just answered it. So
yeah, it's a huge tension, and I don't know. It's interesting because I was reading a biography of John Calhoun, of the Civil War era fame. At one point, his seat was imperiled. He says, "You know what? If I lose, I lose. I've had a good career. I feel like the people of South Carolina can choose someone else. I'd consider it a fair trade. I've had, so it's just that sort of sense of, I'm going to render my public service in the best way I can and then move on, which is what I think sort of a statesmanship, aspires to. And that's disappearing. I'll tell you one just quick story with Paul Simon that I like. Paul Simon loved to read constituent letters, and he would personally answer them. So he got this one letter from a constituent who was just angry at him about a particular issue. I'm not even sure what it was. And he just ripped into him, Senator Simon, I'm so angry about you on this issue. You say this and this and this, and I disagree completely. I think your position should be this and this and this. So I'm furious at you. And Simon wrote a letter back and says, dear so-and-so, thank you for your letter. It seems that on this issue you believe this and you believe it strongly. And on this issue I believe this and I believe it strongly. So if this is an important issue for you, you should vote for someone else. But just let's think about that for a second, because he didn't call this person stupid or a traitor, didn't challenge their motives, nor did he say, well, we're actually a little closer than you think. You know, we're not that far apart. He just basically said, if this is important to you, vote for someone else. And it wasn't a snarky, snide letter. It was completely respectful. I mean, I think that's what we have to get back to. And, you know, Simon was one of the most successful Illinois politicians of the 20th century. He may have, to be candid, I don't know where he was if he had announced that he was going to retire from the Senate or not. But he would write these letters throughout his career. And he spent 10 years in the House in Southern Illinois, and not everyone agreed with his position on issues. And he got a lot of blowback, particularly on gun issues, and he was in conflict with people. But he was a straight shooter, and he was able to have a really good career. So I think it's possible.
Talking about statesmanship among politicians, what about statesmanship among journalists? You recommended PBS as a source of evening news. What should we be reading?
It's a great, I actually have just written an essay about the 12 books everyone should read to navigate this current situation. And I have biographies of Eisenhower, who I have great respect for, and Truman, George Marshall, who I have great respect for. A wonderful history book called The March of Folly by Barbara Tuchman, about how governments tend to do things that are kind of contrary to its own interests. One of my favorite books is called The Warmth of Other Suns, about the African-American migration from the South to the Northeast, which just kind of shows the richness of our culture. So in terms of, reporters, PBS, I see someone like Judy Woodruff interview people, and she's politely tough on everyone. At no point do I think that she's, giving one side a harder go than the other, but she's sort of politely skeptical of really everyone. But it's interesting because I think fewer and fewer journalists just kind of jump out at me as being, totally fair-minded. I think journalists have also gotten kind of sucked into these partisan battles in which, you're identified as either a pro or anti-Trumper, and there's not many people. There's a guy, David Ignatius, from the Washington Post, who writes largely on intelligence and defense issues, who I think is quite fair-minded. But it's a good question.
Do you think we are accepting a different reality in politics now?
Certainly we have a different reality, and I don't know.
How long will we?
Yeah.
I wonder how long that will go on. I mean, it's also going along with this being antagonistic and causing problems, and it doesn't seem that it's necessary to say that's not true.
Yeah. I don't know what how the fever breaks. I don't quite know where we got to this place. My dad, I'll just a personal note. My dad is 92. He worked at CAT all his life as an engineer, but very interested in politics and all. And grew up in a farm in Iowa during the Depression, and he went to Korea. His brother went to World War II. And he says, when he was growing up in the farm in Iowa in the 1930s, unemployment was 25%. He says, farms were being repossessed. I mean, the world was unraveling. And he said, yet somehow we seem to make kind of better grounded decisions than people are making now with a full employment economy. And I don't think he maybe fully appreciates all the tensions of what it's like now, particularly for older workers, and downsizing, and the gig economy and all the pressures in that places, and health insurance and all. But it is an important question that how could a country that was so utterly resilient in the 1930s through just stunning challenges have become so almost schizophrenic and fragile now? I don't know what's happened. I don't know. And I'm a boomer, so you can blame the boomers. And then there may be some culpability there. I don't know if it's totally a generational thing, but I hope we can get back to a little bit better, our better traditions. Because I don't think this is our best selves right now. This is not the best country we could be.
John?
Yeah, you mentioned kicking the can down the road a couple times. Is that, it seems to me it's been around for a while, but now it's such a part of government that all these problems created by kicking the can down the road are solved, temporarily at least, by kicking it down even further. And as you mentioned about the 1990 thing, some of the issues we have today could have been solved fairly easily. And that's, well, I think everybody knows that, but somehow it just goes on and on. You ever see a time to figure that out and have deadlines and make decisions? And
the one thing that I've noticed as a reporter, there's a lot of real constraints to American democracy. I mean, I think it's very representative. A lot of voices are heard. The one thing that I think democracy does badly is solve long-term challenges. It just seems like it's not until the wolves are at the door pounding away that that something happens. And as someone who covered budget policy for a quarter century, as I said, there were fixes that would have caused modest pain, but even at that point, they would have been phased in over 15 years, 20 years, and it would have there would have been some tough votes, but those were deferred. And so when we finally do take action on fiscal policy, I'm imagining it's going to be as a result of a crisis in which we have to do some very draconian things. So I think it is endemic to democracy that it's just not a system of government that's good at saying, okay, here's a problem that it's not acute now, but it's going to be hugely acute in 25 years. So if we can do some minor adjustments now, it might cause a little pain, but not too much, let's do it. As I read American history, we've never been good at that. I think we're probably particularly bad at it now, but I can't even really identify too many periods where there are a lot of just real visionaries. I would say someone like Lincoln, here he is fighting a civil war, and he's also approving bills to have land-grant colleges and extend the railroads. And so there was a sense of, this war is going to end at some point. Roosevelt, in the middle of World War II, was thinking about the post-war structure, a United Nations, International Monetary Fund. So I don't think we usually are very good at it, but I think right now we have certainly the long-term problem-solving muscle has not been used for a long time, and it's going to be hard to get it reactivated, I think.
I had a professor a while back who argued that we needed to give more power back to the states in order to start solving real issues and look more at the long term, because it's on a smaller scale, so they have more of an ability to control kind of variable in the long term. So how do you think we would get back to that, and do you think it would help, maybe?
I think our system, there was a book that came out some years ago called Laboratories of Democracy, and that was the argument that states are, they're a small enough, in most cases, political entity that you can experiment and create, interesting programs, and particularly if they work, ramp them up to the national scale. I haven't worked in state government for a long time, so I don't know to what extent that is occurring, but I think that's always been the hope, that a lot of the creative policies might be developed at the state level, and then they can be, scaled up, to the national level.
Did you have a question, Wes?
Oh, you can go first.
Oh, I can go first. Hang on. Okay. Go ahead.
At the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned Joe Biden's name in a story.
Oh, yeah. So let me tell you my Joe Biden story. I'm doing this book on Senator Lugar, and Senator Lugar is being so modest that I can't really get him to say anything too much. And Lugar and Biden sat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee together for 34 years. And they knew each other well, they respected each other. At this point, Joe Biden is the vice president. And I'm thinking, I'm finishing up my book on Lugar, and I'm like, God, I would really love to be able to talk to Joe Biden. He could really give some insight. So I get a hold of this press person, and he says, well, let's see, and he stalls a little bit. I think he then contacted the Lugar people to see if I was legitimate, if this was going to be I don't know what was said, but he then gets back to me and says, okay, we can set up an interview. He said, 2 options. We could do a phone interview for 15 minutes next week, or you could come in for a one-on-one interview in 6 weeks. I had actually interviewed Biden in the Senate, and I knew the key, and it doesn't take a genius to figure this out. If you get in a one-on-one meeting with Biden, he's going to talk. So it's much, much better to have a one-on-one meeting. So I said, okay, I'll wait 6 weeks. And the thing is, it wasn't a totally easy call because, things get busy and your request gets pushed away, and I wasn't really sure how that was going to play out. So the day arrives, and it's like 1 o'clock, and so I, go to the White House press room, and his press person comes out and grabs me and escorts me into his office. And my name didn't mean anything, but as soon as he saw me, he remembered me from covering Congress. He said, "Oh man, how you doing? What's going on? What's up?" And he throws his arm around me and he says, "Let me show you around the office." So he's showing me around the office. Let me stop here and say, his press secretary says, "You have 15 minutes and I'm going to throw you out." So and he's showing me around the office. "Okay, great, Mr. Vice President." He says, "Well, come on." So we sit down and we're sitting down. He says, it's about 1:50. He says, "What'd you have for lunch?" And I'm fine. He says, "What'd you have for lunch?" I said, I don't really remember. So he reaches into his desk, grabs a candy bar, and throws it to me. I'm catching a candy bar from Joe Biden. My wife later says, "What'd you do with it?" I said, "I ate it." What am I do? Put it in my files or something? So Joe Biden throws me a Snickers bar or something. So we're sitting down. He says, "What are you drinking?" "What are you drinking?" I said, "I'm fine." He goes, "Hang on a second." So he goes into his refrigerator and tosses me this bottle of water. I catch it. So, we're about 10 minutes into the interview already, and it's, okay, how's he going? And the interesting thing is, they wanted to know what questions I was going to ask, and he had notes, because he wanted some things to say. I mean, he liked Lugar, he respected him, but he wanted to make it a fair-minded interview. He had some criticisms that he wanted to make. So the interview begins, and the thing is, he asked Biden one question, and just going on. So it's like, oh my gosh. And so, one question, how would you evaluate Senator Lugar? And he's going on and on and on. And then I'm like, oh my God. And then I said, ask a question about Mitch McConnell and Lugar. And he says, hang on a second. And he reaches across the way and he turns off my tape recorder. He says, "McConnell is a expletive, deleted, it's on." Then he turns back and says, "Senator McConnell was a challenging senator to deal with." And he's talking this and that, and he's getting up and gesturing. And so then his press person comes in, and she's just, shooting daggers at me. And I'm like, so I said, "Okay, Mr. Vice President, I know, we need to be wrapping up now." And he says, "Oh no, I'm just starting." His press secretary her head noticeably slumps down. The day's schedule has been shattered. So Biden is going on for over an hour. And finally, I can hear some kind of unrest in the outer office. And about 4 people walk in and they say, "Mr. Vice President, President Obama is scheduled to see you in 1 minute." He says, "Okay, I'm almost done." But he was, the thing is, he was really perceptive in the sense that he said Lugar's been a great senator, he's really made a contribution. He says, but there's been critical times when he hasn't broken with his party when he should have, and he knows it. There was a couple examples that he gave him. He thought the Iraq War was one of them. He said, "I think Lugar did not quite, play did not fully assume the statesman's mantle." So he was very, very, very fun to talk to, and the funny thing is, I had forgot to turn my cell phone off, and my wife knew that I had 15 minutes. Like it's 17 minutes into it, my phone is ringing, and I know it's her saying, "How did the Biden interview go?" And then it stops and it starts up again. I was like, oh my God! So it was good. So I was at a recent talk. They said, "Do you think he's going to run for president?" I said, "I think he is. I mean, whether he wins or not will be." Although I think in a crowded field, he has a real chance.
Are you going to write his book?
He's written several books, and so yeah. No, I don't think I would. I don't think I will write that book.
So Dennis and Judy, when Don, were you out there as well, when he spoke to the World Affairs Council?
Yes.
And
yes.
who else was on the panel? Do you even remember?
I remember talking, Senator Biden talking to some of us, I don't know what group
There were
I said,
other
at the
people.
Senate office building.
Yeah.
He talked so long, I actually wandered away.
Well, and the buses wanted us to leave, and he wouldn't stop talking to people. You know, and people would be standing up on chairs so that they could, he came out into the crowd. And he was fine staying there all day to talk to us.
Yeah,
When he was still senator. So, yeah.
I had done a long interview with him when he was a senator. He was the top Democrat in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And it was the same thing. I had like 45 minutes. And, you know, like we were well into an hour, and he had just gotten back from a summer vacation, and he's telling the secretary, hey, bring in my photographs. I want to show them to him. So he is this totally accessible, warm guy, and he's unmanageable. In terms of the kind of modern era of staying on message and repeating the same things over and over again. So I will, but let me just make you one interesting point. We had a speaker at the Simon Institute earlier this week, an African-American gentleman, a representative named Chris Welch, who's a top House Democrat. We were talking afterwards. He said, I think the Democrats feel like they need to have a white man on the ticket. He said, I know everyone says it's going to be a woman or a person of color. He says, I think that they saw that the Trump election triggered a backlash in white America, and they're going to have to go with a white man. So it was interesting that he had such a strong visceral interpretation of what happened in the last election. So maybe one more question.
So you said you're working on some sort of an outline for a civil discussion in town hall meetings. How are you going to address and keep a crowd, left wing, that will intentionally walk in and their mission is to disrupt the whole thing and shout and scream and carry on and have no interest in discussion?
Or the MAGA crowd on the other side.
Well, no, but let me answer that in a couple ways. One, when I was doing this research for town hall meetings, I came across two groups. One on the strongly conservative, one strongly liberal. Both of them have the exact same playbook about how to effectively disrupt town hall meetings. Bring all your buddies, pack the room. When he says something, he or she says something that you don't like, boo. If you have a microphone and he's evading the question, don't relinquish the microphone. I mean, just all of these tactics, and both parties use them. Sherry Bustos, the congresswoman from the Quad Cities, says when she's back in the district, there is a tracker, someone with a video, who literally all of her public appearances is tracking them, and a lot of times say, hey, what do you think about this and that, trying to get someone to say, something stupid or inappropriate. So it is a huge challenge, and I don't know that we solved it. I mean, the one thing that I suggested, and I think is potentially important, is to have a nonpartisan moderator begin the proceedings and basically say, these are the ground rules. You're going to be allowed. We're going to have the policymaker is allowed to speak for 7 or 10 minutes, because you hear some reports about people having an hour-long town meeting and playing, the Pledge of Allegiance, and killing 45 minutes with pleasantries, speaking for 12 minutes, taking one question, and then running out the back door. So some strictures about what the public official, the limit to what they can say, and then just trying to inject some civility into it through the ground rules of the moderator. Interestingly, there's in this project I came across a former State Department diplomat, who's worked quite a bit in conflict resolution and mediation, who has gotten very interested in this topic, and she's saying, it's critical how you configure rooms, to sometimes even have it in a circle rather than like this. Not have a podium, just have people sitting down to make it look more accessible. I can't say I feel like I've solved the problem. And one of the points we make in this paper is that, again, it's part of the citizens' responsibility. I mean, we say citizens should go to town hall meetings. They should prepare in the way they would for a business meeting. and treat people in a way that they would feel proud if their kids were in the audience. I don't know if we can elevate the debate. We got a lot of positive reaction, but then this was in the late summer, and then it shifted to the campaign mode, and town hall meetings were pretty much set aside for rallies and debates and that sort of thing. So, am I certain it's going to work? Absolutely not. I think it's worth seeing if there might be some ways we can do it, but all the problems you identified are there. I can't pretend that they're not.
John, did you get the last one?
Okay, a real downer, back to state government. You mentioned getting people to stay in leadership. And I'll preface this by saying I think whether they be Democrat or Republican, we're very lucky in this area with the quality of legislators we have in both the House and State Senate. However, I've been studying state government since 1970, my political science as a teacher. And the reality is, Michael Madigan has primarily been in charge screwing the state. But even when the Republicans were in charge, they were screwing the state just as bad as Madigan was. So we have neither party's leadership who care about the state, they only care about their power. How do we get these people who get primaried if they challenge either the Republican? I had a chance to watch that happen, 5 Republicans who challenged a Republican position. Jim Edgar got his legs cut out from under him by Madigan on the property tax change when he thought he was going. How do we in Illinois get rid of that power structure for both parties to actually have states have the ability?
Yeah, no, that's a profound question. I mean, when I started out in Springfield, Mike Madigan was the House Democratic leader. That was in 1979, 40 years ago. Obviously, my view is very few people, probably should stay in a job for 40 years. I mean, it's hard to look at the world fresh or to be creative. I don't know the mechanism by which someone like Speaker Madigan is removed or asked to leave and fresher blood comes in. But and I think it's like in the House Democrats in Washington, you have a leadership that is very elderly. And there's some rising young stars, including Sherry Bustos, who I would not be stunned if she's House Speaker in 4 or 6 years. But I don't, it's one of the kind of cosmic problems is once people are in power, very few want to walk away with grace. And my wife and I are going to go see Hamilton next week, and seeing George Washington, voluntarily walk away from power is one of the most stirring things any of us can, and hopefully more lawmakers will see Hamilton and be inspired. That may be the best we can hope for. So.
Well, just lastly, the idea of the primaries, getting primary, and that's where people actually don't go vote, and yet that might be the most important election to actually get following people. Do you have anything in the Alzheimer's Center that where we could go to get people? People actually have to get out and vote for people in the United States.
And one of my concerns about primaries is that, I mean, in terms of actively trying to encourage them, is in some cases, the people who are being primary are ones who are trying to solve problems. They're trying to reach across the aisle and work with someone from the other party. And that's why, it's like, oh my God, so-and-so, Senator Bennett he isn't a loyal Republican. He's having a lunch once a week with a Democrat. So that's my concern about the whole primary thing. It's actually oftentimes driven by the ideological extremes in both parties. And they go after the problem solvers who are seen as not sufficiently, party line and loyal and all. So, it's, I don't know. I mean, it's.
You're like me, frustrated, really don't have.
Yeah, and it's, you would hope that someone would, after a certain point would say, I've done my best service. It's time for someone else to step in. But that's a hard thing, and not everyone is good at it.
So did you get to answer yet?
No, I didn't. What is your observation or feelings about the effectiveness of third parties?
I don't think that they're particularly effective in our current structure, the Electoral College and all. I'll end by telling a story. A friend of mine, this was the 2000 election. Gore versus Bush. And he's very, very left of center. He says, Gore, Bush doesn't make any difference. I'm a Ralph Nader guy. I want to be that. So he was living in Los Angeles, and he was out, pushing Ralph Nader. And I said, it's going to be Gore or Bush. One of them's going to win. And I guess if I were you, I'd choose who's, but no, you're being too cynical, So the Saturday before the Tuesday election, and this is my friend, he's handing out Ralph Nader pamphlets in South Central Los Angeles and beating the doorsteps. So the Saturday before the election, I'm in a bookstore in Washington, the one where I thought of my Eisenhower Kennedy book, flipping through a book, and I look over, and I see Ralph Nader in jeans, T-shirt, flipping through, philosophy of history or something. Now, he's running for president. He's going to be on the ballot in 3 days. He's reading a book in DuPont Circle, and my friend is knocking on doors. So I call him up. I says, "Now, isn't the candidate supposed to work at least as hard as the volunteers?" And as it happened, this is a little flip answer. As it turned out, I just heard this number. Nader got 93,000 votes in Florida, and Gore lost by 587 votes in Florida. So I tend to see in our current structure third parties as more of the vanity of wealthy people. Typically, Mike Bloomberg thought about it and then pulled back. Now the gentleman from Starbucks now. If the observation is that our political system has kind of broken away from centrist problem solvers, I tend to agree with it. But I just don't think the way our electoral laws are structured that a third-party candidate is likely to win. And, unless they had an utterly compelling campaign and message, I would not be inclined to vote for them. I guess I approach voting much more practically and say, in our current world, it's going to be a Democrat or Republican, and which one do I prefer? That's my perspective. It's probably not the most lofty, but to me it's the most grounded in realism.
Very good. So he's given us a lot to think about on this nice chilly January evening. So,
and if I could just say, if at some point I could come back and talk about the statesmanship book, because it will be coming out, and I'd love to, when I have something more concrete to present you, I'd love to have you guys review it and see if we're in the right direction or if it's helpful or not. So.
And I would like to encourage any of the students who are here to talk to you about your college students coming down to Southern for the program. Because I think that would
absolutely.
be very, very beneficial. Bradley does sponsor an internship in Washington, D.C. So if you're not interested in studying abroad, you can study in D.C. and work for a lot of different members of Congress or organizations in D.C. that work with the U.S. government. So, so that would be something that you should think about doing in your college career as well. A quick housekeeping note from my students in IS 100, you need to write that paragraph in the extra credit assignment spot on Sakai in order to get extra credit for coming tonight. But thank you for coming tonight. So if you purchased a book, he has indicated a willingness to sign your book. So with that, join me in thanking Mr. Shaw. The next event for the World Affairs Council is February 24th. It is a Sunday afternoon at 2 p.m. Journalism Under Fire. We have a couple of short documentaries and then a nice panel discussion with a couple of experienced journalists. Krista McHugh has she has covered a number of areas for the Stanley Foundation. Rwanda, Chechnya, Bosnia, Cambodia, lots of interesting places. And Jenny Monet is a Native American journalist who will share her experiences of finding danger as a journalist here in the United States. So that is Sunday the 24th. On February the 28th, we're having a fabulous dinner at ICC and Taste of India. Tickets are already half sold out. So if you'd like to join us for that, don't delay in purchasing your ticket. So come join the World Affairs Council and enjoy programs like this. Thank you. Drive safely, walk safely, and we'll see you all tomorrow.
Tomorrow. Oh, God, students.
Right. Well, it's good to see you again.